Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Slice of the Reef, our new podcast that demystifies the art of saltwater fish keeping. My name is Billy.
And I'm Giancarlo, aka Banana or Fishy Fish. We're going to be your guides today into the amazing world beneath the waves, but also in the box in your living room. Crazy, huh?
Enjoy and easy reefing. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 5 of Slice of the Reef, a podcast where me and my buddy talk about reefing and then all the ins and outs of beginning reefing, advanced reefing, middle of the road reefing, all sorts of reef stuff.
All of the reefing.
Today's topic is, can you read it?
We're going to basically run down coral difficulty and scale it in terms of how we think you should be adding it to your tank. Now, this isn't set in stone, but if you want to dabble your toes or get involved into reefing for a bit, this is the order that we scale the difficulty in, so that when you do start purchasing coral or adding it, you can sort of have a guide to follow it.
A central anthem of our podcast is that reefing takes time if you're going to do it well, and part of that time is taking baby steps in terms of difficulty, starting with the corals whose hair has been solved for decades, to make sure that there aren't any unknown contaminants or measurement issues or weird chemicals leaching into your reef. And that way you don't spend a bunch of money on a coral that you aren't quite ready for, and then you lose it and it frustrates you and you leave the hobby. So taking baby steps so you don't move too quickly and burn out too fast.
The hobby's pricey enough without buying coral just to watch it die in your tank.
Exactly. So a few notes on schedule. We record our live podcast sessions in our Discord server every Tuesday, and then every Friday or so, every Friday morning, we'll be publishing a new episode on most of the more popular podcatcher apps, if you don't want to catch the live session, so to speak. So the thing we're going to talk about today is brief update for our own hobbies and our own tanks. Giancarlo, how is your tank doing?
Well, I spent the full last week removing my sump and putting in a new one. And I gotta say, that thing is a beast. I am so happy with how it's going right now. It flows well. I finally have enough room to watch the Cheeto and the macroalgae and refugium tumble. Before, it was sitting still, and the problem with sitting still is that you'll just have a layer of long hair algae growing on top. You're basically growing long hair algae. At that point, just buy an algae scrubber. I'm happy with it. I was able to put a reef mat into it, so no more changing filter socks every single week. I'm not even kidding. I was at the point where I would put new ones in. 3 to 4 days later, it'd be full. My bio load is high enough where a reef mat is either use or lose, and then that's it. Oh, we got MP60s. Thing is a monster. 40% down, it'll blow water all the way across the tank.
Yeah, those things are insane.
It is wild.
So why did you buy them if they're just going to run at 40%?
I'm not running at 40. I'm running it at 70. One of the MP60s I actually sent back to Ecotech because I want to get the cable extended.
Well, my reefing journey is going very smoothly. I set up a new tank for my Gigantea and clownfish tank, kind of like my little species tank. It's still trying to actively embrace the heaters in the tank, to the point where it snuck through the barrier I put in there between the heaters and the rest of the tank, and its foot was like a millimeter away from the bottom of one of my heaters. So now I need to figure out a different method or just install the divider better. But yeah, that's a very interesting problem.
Have you tried? Why does your NEM love the heater so much?
I don't know. I thought it was temperature at first, so I put my inkbird in there temporarily, but it stays at it maxes out at 84, and then the lowest it hits is 82. I think it might just be if it's very obviously in a temperature gradient, it's going to follow the gradient towards the heat, maybe. So it's like an automatic unconscious thing, or he's just suicidal and wants to end his life.
You should add another heater to the other side of the tank. See what I mean?
No, but then it'll start spinning. Oh, and then I can have a perpetual motion.
Exactly. It'll never stop spinning. Limitless power. The clouds are still hosting it, right?
Yes, yeah. And they're fully paired now. I have 2 porcelain crabs on there.
I saw the picture. Those are so cute. I love porcelains, man.
They're both females, so they probably won't pair, but they're cautiously avoiding each other.
What's a big man? They got room.
It's like a ring around the rosy thing, where if one moves, the other one moves in the opposite direction, so they're like orbiting. Very cute.
Perpetual circle, or perpetual motion machine inside another perpetual motion machine.
Exactly. But yeah, my main tank with all of its high maintenance corals and stuff is basically on autopilot. I do water changes every week and top off canister, and everything's good. So that's how our stuff is going. Next thing we talk about is upcoming local events. I mentioned this last week, but there is still a coral farmers market coming up currently as of recording, the upcoming Saturday, the 10th. If you are interested in joining us and you're in Southern California, look up SoCal Coral Farmers Market. Just look that up and it'll show you the website. It's run by Steve Tyree, who's like the grandfather of the whole hobby, and he shows up almost every time, and it's hard for me not to totally fangirl about him. Steve Tyree runs the Coral Farmers Market. He might not have like an online store. I do know most of his favorite corals are sold by Garrett's Acropolis. So if you do want his stuff, and I think I showed you this guy. Garrett's Acropolis loves like table and corals. Anyway, that's the only imminent event that we have. So I'll hopefully see some of you there if you live in SoCal.
Did you realize, Billy, we're posting these online about 4 to 5 weeks ahead after we record them.
Yeah.
So by the time anyone actually hears this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, it'll be like the week passed already.
Well, maybe in 5 weeks they'll have time travel and they can go back.
Probably, yeah. This is why you go to listen to this ahead of time, or join the Discord and listen to it there. We do have live listeners that we're talking to.
Oh yeah, so we're not just talking to ghosts. There's actual people having discourse in the chat. Feel free to questions in the chat, and we'll address them at the end of the podcast.
Yes, sir. So yeah, the way we designed the tier system is we broke it up into 6 different tiers. Tier 1 being the easiest, and tier 6 being hardest. So first, we're gonna talk about coral that you can add as a beginner to test the water, and then you've got things that are a little more difficult but are still fairly easy. Then the biggest break is between tiers 2 and 3, where you realize that you're going to start dealing with things that have skeletons, and that will require more testing, and the core will get a little harder to keep. And then the part where most people settle at is tiers 4 and 5. Tier 4 being the more difficult skeletal coral, and then tier 5 being things that are frequently bought and frequently lost. A common result of these coral being purchased is that they will die. Tier 6 is the hardest coral to keep alive, and these have like a 90% chance of dying. The odds are, if you're buying this, it will most likely die for you.
Or you've reached an echelon in the hobby where you know exactly what to look for, you know what kind of specimen not to buy. You know how to transport it, how to acclimate it, and how to feed it. It's basically like keeping a dolphin. So if you're a public aquarium planning to keep a dolphin, you've been thinking about keeping a dolphin for 10 years and you are ready. These corals are basically dolphins. So yeah.
Basically.
Treat it like a scientific venture rather than an impulse purchase. Okay, tier 1. These are the corals that you could technically add to your tank on the first day. But for stress and money reasons, I would recommend waiting at least a couple weeks. These are the corals that you use to test the waters to see if your tank is suitable for any corals, let alone the more expensive ones. In this tier are mushroom corals, which are technically more of a anemone coral hybrid. They're called corallomorphs, and there's a bunch of different types, but the easiest one to keep are called discosoma mushrooms. They've been in the hobby for decades, so they're relatively easy to find cheap. Or there are really expensive ones you'll end up seeing called eclectus discosoma, which are very expensive and very pretty. But you can start with the really cheap ones, and if you love the expensive ones and you can keep the cheap ones alive, you have a good candidate for your tank. Also in this category are leather corals. That is a very general category for a wide range of soft corals, mostly from the Red Sea, I believe. The issue you're going to have with leathers is finding an attractive one. A lot of leathers out there are kind of ugly and brown and lumpy, but if you have folks with the right sourcing and you have a good local fish store, the one you're going to be looking for, especially as a beginner, is the long polyped green toadstool. Those are like the prettiest ones. And if you can find it, try to get the weeping willow toadstool. That one's more of a holy grail in our hobby because it's very rare right now.
Willow is very hard to find. I've been trying to find one. I can't find it. I mean, I can find it. I just don't want to pay like the coral plus shipping for just that one thing. Crazy. Yeah, the Japanese weeping willow. That's the pinnacle of reefing.
I've never seen that. Is that the Fiji one? Or
Fiji. It's very, very neon green, very beautiful green, and super long polyps. I'm talking like 2-inch or 1.5-inch long polyps. You'll know Japanese when you see it, because there's the ones that are like half an inch long, but then there's the ones that are actual weeping willows, and they have the long polyps. They're not just long polyps, the long polyps.
So the problem with being a beginner in this hobby is even in the beginner corals, there's an incredible amount of depth and a wide spectrum of cost. But for the most part, these corals are going to be bulletproof. So even if it is relatively expensive, you can start pretty confidently with these in your newer tank.
Oh yeah.
Last two are the kind of bulletproof ones for most people, although I think both me and Banana have managed to kill them multiple times. That's
Several times.
pulsing xenia and green star polyp, or any sort of star or clove polyp.
GSP.
Yeah, typically called GSP. Pulsing xenia is in basically every reef tank because it's not only beautiful and has a cool pulsing motion that it evolved because it grows in stagnant waters, it makes its own flow, but also because it grows very fast and is difficult to kill. Green star polyp, similarly, it's a little bit less virulent when it's in a tank, and it is a really crazy bright neon green.
These are tried and true. Like these are all tried and true coral. These are coral that you're gonna find people giving away pieces of. These are coral that you're gonna find that can grow anywhere. Like I've left leather coral outside of my tank overnight for like 2 days, and I came back and I was like, oh shit, I put it back in the tank, and a week later it was fine. Like it did not care. It did
Fully
not
dried
care.
out.
It wasn't fully dried out. It was very spongy. And like
Mm.
it did take a little bit of like recovery, you know, because some of the tissue died off on the outside. But yeah, I was amazed. I was really amazed. I was like, how did this?
I mean, if you think about it, a lot of corals evolved to live in intertidal zones, which means sometimes they're either getting fully baked by the sun, like direct 2000 par sunlight, or they're just literally out of the water for a couple hours every day.
Yep, and the fact that they're so easy to keep means that they are common. So normally we would say don't buy coral, just test it out, you know, don't buy coral just to wait for it to die. But odds are there's within like 30 minutes of you, there's gonna be 4 or 5 people giving away Cynia. There's gonna be 4 or 5 people that have GSP, they can cut your little frag off, that they won't charge you. These are coral that I would rarely recommend you actually pay a fair amount for. You should never pay for Cynia.
Yeah.
Someone around you is gonna have Cynia for free. Someone around you will have GSP for free.
If they insist on selling it, pay like $10 to $15 for a big chunk.
Yeah, like a very fairly sized roll, because this stuff grows like a weed. And then we do generalize what we're saying here, but there are different kinds of everything. Like leathers, for example, there's a specific kind called the Fiji yellow leather, the yellow Fiji yellow,
Yeah.
and that one in particular is harder to keep. Like I'd say tier 4, tier 5 harder to keep, where you will need more experience feeding things. Zinnia has a wide range of prices. I have a more rare strain of Zinnia called Ruby Red that is around 50 to 80 for a piece, whereas regular Zinnia you can get for free.
Awesome. Before we go into tier two, the only parameters you really need to test for tier one corals are your salinity and your temperature. If those are in line and you're having trouble keeping a tier one coral, you should audit and like double check the testing method you're using. So if you have a refractometer, make sure it's calibrated. If you have a hydrometer, make sure it's not bad. And if those are in line, then something else is causing issues. So, for example, when I bought my first piece of green star polyp, it was because I accidentally added LFS water to my tank that had copper in it. So copper is very toxic to corals and immediately died. So if you're having issues and your parameters seem in line, look for other options. Look for pieces of metal in your tank, do water changes, stuff like that. I also had duct tape in my sump, probably not a good move, like wet duct tape. Yeah.
Keep it all together.
All right, tier two. Once you've successfully kept a tier one coral and it's taking over your tank, as they do, these are the corals that you can move on to. Zoas are another really wide category of corals, but for the most part, they're going to be mostly bulletproof. Colt corals is another type of soft coral, I believe. Is it a soft coral?
Colts are soft. They're like leathers, but they're a little more finicky.
Yeah, they're more like finger shaped and a little bit more sensitive, but they also look very cool, and they have like a dark purple to brown range of color that is kind of difficult to find in other corals. And the Duncan coral. Duncan can either be in tier 1 or tier 2, but we put it in tier 2 just because there's an additional level of testing that you want to do to make sure it's settled in and it has all of the nutrients it's going to need.
Exactly. Odds are, if you can't keep a tier 1 coral, you should move on to tier 2. If you can't keep tier 2, don't move on to tier 3. We recommend you moving slower.
And I mean, people jump tiers all the time, and sometimes it works, but
there's always exceptions to it.
Exactly. There's additional risk involved and a little bit more stress, and you probably want to buy another test kit or two to make sure that all the parameters are in line.
Oh, with Zoas, you'll know you're buying a harder to keep Zoa if they're charging you like hundreds for it. The very common ones, the very easy to keep ones, are more likely to spread and reproduce in the tank, but because of that, they'll be a lot cheaper and they'll be a lot more accessible to find. But the more difficult ones, like stratospheres or a few years ago GMKs, those that cost a couple hundred per polyp, you're not going to find them everywhere, because odds are they're at that price because people are still finally figuring out how to breed them, still finally figuring out how to get them to the systems, and they're a little more rare. So as a beginner, you shouldn't be spending hundreds on coral unless you're spending hundreds on basic coral.
Kind of like crypto, don't invest in corals that you cannot afford to lose. If you're on a very, very small budget, you should try to get freebies, and it's worth waiting for freebies. Before you talk about tier 3, once you add Dunkins to your tank, like I mentioned before, you should start testing for calcium. And again, don't, if you can avoid it, if you can afford it, don't get the API Saltwater Master Test Kit or the Saltwater Reef Master Test Kit, whatever they are, with a bunch of different test kits in it, because they are very inaccurate, especially the calcium one. If you do it wrong even slightly, it's going to be off by 100 points. So go for the Salifert calcium test. And honestly, if you have one Dunkin in like a 10-gallon tank, it's not going to consume a lot of calcium. You will be able to outpace its consumption with water changes, but knowing what the level is at and figuring out, doing all the like the chemistry and stuff and watching the number go up and down as it absorbs stuff and you replace it is a fundamental thing that you need to get used to as you start going up to tier 3.
Tier 3 is the fun one. It's when you get all the hard stuff in. And by hard, I mean things with the skeleton. It's stuff that requires more testing because of the skeletons. It's stuff that requires more nutrient-rich water because these are it's rock with flesh, right? It's algae with a skeleton. That's how you describe coral. That's coral. Coral is algae with a skeleton, basically. So they do need nutrients to grow. And then here we're gonna start off with the hammers. With Euphilia in general, hammers, octos, frog spawn, and framers are 4 of the more common Euphilia that you'll find around. And these are all fairly easier to keep than other things with the skeleton. Monties are also really, really good beginner hardies because it takes a lot to kill them and they will bounce back from almost anything. But at the same time, they do have a skeleton, they have polyps, they do follow the same requirements. So if you want to start off with hard coral, I would recommend you get a Monty first above anything else. This is where you start like differentiating the 2 different things, LPS and SPS, and that's how you start getting into, you know, the bony world. LPS stands for large polyp stony, hard coral that has bigger polyps, and then SPS, small polyp stony, are, you know, coral with polyps that look like tiny little flowers on the skeleton. Pachylophora, Stylophora, those are 2 other very, very easy SPS to get into. Pachy's are very, very cool and they have fairly neon glow to them. Stylos are very, very hairy and also very easy to keep.
I'd call them fuzzy.
Fuzzy? You call them fuzzy?
I have the one stylo I've managed to keep alive, and we'll talk about this later, has relatively long polyps, like almost like a micro alveopora, but it took a very long time to extend that length. And it was in a very specific level of flow where it started doing that. Sorry, I'm just being pedantic. It will have shorter polyps than like the flower pots or the Astropora, stuff like that. It's still fuzzy and it still looks really cool in flow.
And then with Monties, there's a lot of different Monties to try. I would recommend the plating. Encrusting Monties are a little harder to keep, and so platings are usually the way to go.
You should go for our red or green Monty Cap. We call it Monty Cap, but it's actually Montipora capricornus. Super hardy. It's not like a super beginner coral. The main issue you're going to have with Monties is it's going to struggle a little bit if you don't have a strong enough light. But I've kept it in maybe like 75 par and it browned out for a bit, but eventually caught up and started growing like crazy.
Yeah, there's a lot of different kinds. There's Crested tuberculata, Florida, Friabilis or Friabilis. Every coral has 10 different subspecies.
The hobby is very complicated already, and it will continue to get more complicated as taxonomists get more and more genetic studies done. These broad strokes, while sometimes inaccurate, are a really great way to get yourself like a base level of knowledge in the hobby. So don't try to learn about every single species at once. Or if you do, go slowly because this stuff takes time.
Yeah, I mean, you learn about it eventually. It's just a matter of patience, practice, and having fun with it. You're here to enjoy the reef, you're enjoying the hobby. How you enjoy things involves taxonomies. Like, I love taxonomies.
Yeah, you just rattled off like 5 different species names I've never heard. I love it.
Really? Yeah, Monties. There's so many Monties. And then when you're encrusted, there's like 4 or 5 more. And considering the fact that we still only know about 40% of what actually goes on in the ocean, who knows if there's dozens of types of Monties that we haven't even discovered yet, or Monties that we already have that are actually different subspecies. Coral get recategorized all the time, and so it's a constantly evolving hobby.
A lot of fun. Okay, once you get to this tier, the reason it starts getting difficult, like Benetta mentioned, is that there's a skeleton you have to take care of, and there's minerals that these stony corals will start uptaking. You don't have to like freak out if the numbers get too low, these corals are hardy enough that for the most part they will be okay if there's lower concentrations of calcium or magnesium in the water, but you don't want it to be low for a prolonged period of time, and you don't want it to hit a certain threshold where the chemistry just stops working properly, because that can stress these corals out. And again, the 3 tests you should have once you start working in this tier are calcium, magnesium, and pH. I think Euphyllia in particular like higher levels of magnesium, or at least they're more sensitive to fluctuations. So if you have a Euphyllia and it's not doing super well, that magnesium test will help you figure out if it's a mineral issue or if something else is going on. Trumpet corals, honestly, they're in the kind of the same twilight zone as Duncan corals. They're still really easy for beginners, especially at the start, because they're not going to absorb enough calcium to really make a difference. But you do want to know what the magnesium is. You do want to be able to test the calcium, and knowing what your pH is. We're going to do like a whole episode on pH and alkalinity and stuff, but knowing what it is super helpful. Okay, tier 4, the danger zone. So in this section are corals that even if you know your tank has the right parameters, even if you know you're able to keep other stony corals, even if you know your light is sufficient for some of these easier corals, they're going to be difficult to keep at first. They might not die, but sometimes they're going to brown out a little bit, or they're going to start losing tissue, and you're going to have to dip it to stop that. Just get into a more advanced and higher risk area of reefing. I'm in this tier right now, and it's honestly not too bad. Most of the time, the only losses I suffer are when I make a really obvious mistake, like if there's copper leaching from a magnet in my tank, or if I do a water change with pure rhody water and my salinity drops 2 points. Stuff like that. Basic stuff that even as a relatively advanced hobbyist, I can still mess up. But I know that for the most part, my tank is going to be okay, and I know what to look for. So I don't really mind a few losses or a few issues, because that's what keeps me in the hobby. In this section, I think I would put Acropora at the top, like very near the next tier, especially for beginners. The reason I say that is sometimes Acropora will just die in a newer tank, and we don't know why. Have you experienced that, Banana?
Yeah, Acropora do love to just die. Acropora love to die, and sometimes we still don't know so much about them, and it could be bacterial, it could be something with the water, it could be something with lights. And because there's so many different variables that are going into keeping coral into everyone else's tanks, it's hard to identify what's killing something. It's probably something in Occam's razor kind of thing, where it's something very, very, very simple, like an RDI unit not being measured properly. Could even go as far as like not having your TDS sensor properly put into your RDI meter, and so you're actually pumping in water full of TDS that's actually messing with the coral. Or it could be something that you have strains of bacteria that most people don't identify in the tank.
Yeah, bacteria, especially for Acropora. I think we're starting to figure out the different species that cause issues and how to treat them, but testing for them is really hit or miss. There's like a broad spectrum bacteria test. I forget what it's called. It's like a microfauna.
But they're pricey. They're a bit pricier. And what it does is essentially breaks down the bacterial cultures that are going in the sample that you sent in.
And so that's kind of like the new frontier of the hobby, is figuring out what those species are, how to test for them, and then how to treat for them. That's why these corals are not recommended for beginners, but they look so cool that sometimes it's worth it, especially if you've made it to tier 3 and you're actively keeping tier 3 corals, and you're ready for the next challenge. I basically jumped from keeping flower pots, which are maybe tier 3, like tier 2 sometimes if you get the right stuff, to keeping Acropora, which is probably the hardest thing in tier 4. And I did have a few losses and I had some issues, like I mentioned, but I was ready for that. I was prepared for the issues, and now I'm successfully in tier 4. Another thing in tier 4 is torch corals, and you'll notice that this is distinct from Euphyllia, which are in tier 3, and it's a tier harder than Euphyllia. So there's 2 reasons for that. One is they are a different species entirely. They will sting hammer corals and octospawn and frog spawn, all those different Euphyllia.
Everything. They'll sting everything. Torches will sting everything.
Yeah. They look angry, and they are angry. They have long sweeper tentacles, and they will win a battle with almost any other coral, but they will get stressed. That's the other reason this coral is in tier 4. Once a torch coral is stressed, it's really susceptible to bacterial infections.
Torches will sting. I don't think there's any coral that a torch won't win against.
It'll even sting other torches. Like you can't, some torches you can't keep together because there's some unknown subspecies or subgenera or whatever, and they'll actively fight each other.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
torches don't lose against anything. They win against everything.
But a lot of people keep them, and a lot of people keep them successfully. The thing you have to be ready for is have the bacterial treatments on hand before you buy the coral, and start with a relatively cheap torch. And when I say cheap, probably the cheapest one you'll be able to find is like 60 to 75 per head. Get one head of like a green torch, that should be around $60, and keep it for like at least a couple months before you try to get some of the more expensive stuff. There are some crazy collector torches out there, like
What?
Rolexes of the torch world.
I don't know what you're talking about. Can't imagine.
Don't you have most of those?
I have a fair amount of them, yeah. Tiger torches, I've got holy grails, I've got, dragon souls are pretty common. I have a huge colony of dragons, so I need to cut that down.
Yeah, the one torch I have is a dragon soul, and it fell off. Like the glue just stopped working, or a turbo snail hit it in the wrong way, and it stung the hell out of one of my flower pots.
Whenever I'm praying SPS, if one falls into the torch, I consider it dead. That's it. It's gone. It's gonna be gone. Yeah, because at that point, there's no bringing it. I've picked it up and glued it back on, but it's very hard for a necro or anything that you cut to come back after you drop it in the torch, because the torch is an endo.
Okay, tier 5, go for it, Banana.
All right, I have a fair amount of experience with these high rate of loss coral that are very finicky. Very, very, like you look at it the wrong way and it'll say, hey, screw you, you're out 500, I'm out. These mainly involve meat coral. Acanthophilia and Endophilia being two big ones. They're really gorgeous coral, really, really, really pretty coral. They fluff up. You'll have a skeleton. I have a skeleton of one that's about 1.5 inches in diameter, but the whole coral puffs out to be around 5 or 6 inches wide. It's a really beautiful coral, beautiful colors. It's like jello. It kind of jiggles a little bit, but they are very finicky. And what I've experienced actually with my meat coral is that they like to have lower nutrient water, which is why I've been experimenting recently with lowering my nutrients a bit. And I've realized that they come out more.
Do you think it's because the coral themselves like the lower nutrients, or is there something else in the tank that like an algae or something that starts growing on the base that thrives in higher nutrients?
I don't think it's the algae. I think it might be the coral itself liking lower nutrients, because the algae, there's no real base to it.
Yeah,
it's all covered in flesh. It's all fleshy.
So, yeah, it does have a base, but that base is like in the sand.
Yeah, all the way at the bottom.
And then there's no light that gets to that base, so there aren't really too many issues. It's like a how would you explain it? It's like a mop that's cut off at the very tip, so it's just like a little bit of wood, but that wood is covered by mop. Yeah, the mop coral.
That's all you see.
So, the reason that these corals are in tier 5, I wouldn't say they're like more. How would I word this? They're not like extra sensitive or anything. They're just really expensive for me.
Yeah, they are. They're very pricey.
Yeah,
they're fairly pricey.
So the only time they're tricky is if you don't know what to look for when you're at the LFS, or if you're looking at them online. I would not recommend buying these without being able to see them in person first, because
100%.
Yeah, a photo can be taken 2 months ago, and the coral could be dead.
I don't recommend buying these online. It's risky unless you see like a live video or a live stream of it where it's open and they're shipping it that exact week. Yeah. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very finicky to ship. Like, there's risk during shipping. There's risk when you get them. I would never buy one of these without seeing it first. Never. Nah. Most of them come from shows. I've gotten a few at a show. Yeah. Whenever there's a show, I'll go and get like 3 or 4 and then put them in my tank. And now everything's stable now. But before, when I had the file fish living among my reef, I lost a fair amount of these.
Yeah. The other problem with these corals is that they're delicious to certain fish who may or may not be reef safe. And so they're super fluffy. They're super bright. They're super colorful. They will attract the attention of those coral nibbling fish. And so then you're really susceptible to getting infections and stuff. So what would you look at if you were thinking of buying a meat coral? What would you inspect it for? What kind of diagnosis would you make?
Make sure it's puffy. Make sure it's opened up completely when you see it. And make sure you don't see any of the skeleton when it's open. Any of the skeleton. You don't want to see the ridges. You don't want to see the mouth gaping open. No skeleton.
Yeah, so it's a stony coral, but you should not see any of the stony part. It should be 100% flesh. Once you're looking at corals like this, you'll know the shape that they should be. Yeah. You should look for, like, if it's a full circle, that's a really good sign. If it's like a really big full circle, like extended way past where the skeleton should be, that's a great sign because it means it's happy, it's fluffy, it's exchanging a lot of water and absorbing a lot of sunlight. If it's a semicircle shaped, that means they cut it in half, and you should absolutely not buy it because it's most likely to die.
They're very prone to infection too.
Yeah.
Very, very prone.
But
I
also
think
that half of it was dying, so they had to cut it in half to sort of like triage it. And that's also a bad sign because it's probably still infected.
most likely, if you want a tier 4 version of these or a tier 3 one, I would say tier 4. But you can try sign arenas. They're a lot easier to keep. They're a lot less finicky. And then Trachyphilia as well are much easier than the actual meat coral. And you'll find them for a lot cheaper too. Whereas Boacanthos go for around 400 or 500. Sign arenas should be like 150 to 200. And then Trachyphilia can be around 150 to 200 as well, depending on where you get them.
Like a green Trachyphilia will be like maybe 75 tops.
Yeah.
So it's a starter coral. Honestly, if I ever got into the big meat corals, I would probably max out at a sign arena because it looks really cool. It looks even more unique, I think, than some of the meat corals out there. But it's not going to cost me 3 paychecks to get. Well, I don't get paychecks.
I've never enjoyed the sign arena. I don't know. Personally, I've never been a big fan of them. I think it's a one coral where I see the ridges and I'm like, no thank you. That's just me though.
Another good, like, easier tier coral is button scolies.
Scolies,
Scolemia in general are a tier 5 coral because again they're going to be really expensive and the colors are super bright, and for some reason they're difficult for local fish stores to keep healthy. But button scolies are a lot easier, and more importantly they're going to be like $50-$60. They're a little bit smaller, but they're a similar species to the bigger scolies, so if you can keep them, it's a really good sign. Do you have any button scolies right now?
I don't like button scolies. They're small and fake.
Wow. Way to undercut my whole point.
I'm not a big fan of button. I have several regular scolies. I have war paints. I have UFOs.
So you have the expensive ones. I don't have any of them because I don't like the big ones. I kind of agree.
I love the big ones. The Croc Island Scoli is my dream Scoli. For those that don't know, there's this very, very specific island in Australia called the Croc Island, and it's populated with saltwater crocodiles. It's actually found a fair amount of them. But the scolies that come from there are phenomenal. They're the kind of coral that you see, and it's just like, holy shit, this is real. This is insane. The scolies from Croc Island they have the most vivid blends of colors. It's insane.
If you do want to keep something like that, try out a button scolie first. These Croc Island ones are gonna be relatively small compared to like the Grandmaster scolies.
Croc Islands are regular. The regular size scolies. I guess it's just a matter of how long you keep them. They're more expensive, so you'll know when you buy them. You're not gonna I accidentally bought this Croc Island scolie. I don't know what to do with it. No, you'll know, because your wallet will be crying. You'll be like, your wallet will be crying when you purchase one.
There's a benefit to the complexity of the hobby. Sometimes LFSs won't know what they're selling. I almost got a glitter bomb Goniopora for like $70. One thing that you'll figure out as you climb up these different tiers is which LFS are capable of climbing the tiers with you. You will eventually give up on certain local fish stores that just cannot keep anything above a tier 4. There's some fish stores that can't keep above a tier 2. So they're only going to be selling Xenia and Green Star Polyp. It's usually because they don't have knowledgeable enough employees.
That's a very good point, but very, very good point with that.
Yeah, and so I have a local fish store who's been running, or like at least been in the coral hobby for 35 years. He keeps the tier 6 corals, which we're going to talk about, and keeps them easily and well.
Damn.
But you're not going to know how advanced these fish stores are until you take the time to climb up yourself and learn stuff.
As you get more experience, you kind of listen. Because when you're like a young pup in reefing, right, you kind of believe everything they tell you, and all your information is what you know so far, which is based off of what they tell you. So
never take advice from anyone who can't keep above a tier 1. So I kind of alluded to this earlier, but there is a tier 6, and this is kind of like the dark realm of reefing, literally and figuratively. Have you kept anything in tier 6?
I have. So tier 6 is the hands down, and this is going to come from most experts, the hardest coral group to keep alive is NPS, non-photosynthetic. Every coral that we've mentioned so far is something that grows, that's basically algae on a stick, algae on a rock. It is photosynthetic. It takes a light, converts it into Zuzan cell. I can't say it. Zuzanthely. Yes. Susan. Susan Philly.
We're
But
definitely pronouncing it, but everyone says that. So
yeah, that's
we selectively,
Susan Philly.
yeah, we've
I like
taken an
Susan Philly.
impossible name and rebranded it to something pronounceable. It'll
This is
happen
gonna
a
be
lot.
copyrighted, by the way. So if you hear any podcast saying Susan Philly, please let us know. It's copyrighted by here. Yeah, hardest coral to keep alive, non-photosynthetic. These do not convert light to, to the algae that they are. They're basically filter feeders, so they do require constant feeding. They do require super nutrient-rich water. They require very, very specific care, and no amount of light or equipment or money that you throw at them will help them grow.
Yeah, and when we say nutrient-rich water, it's the weird nutrients. Like they've evolved to live in certain river outputs or really turbid water that's basically like literally dark. Sometimes they grow in caves where there's no sunlight at all.
No
But there's
light.
like a really weird specific type of plankton, and they eat that plankton. But once you get to this tier, you're going to know what those are, and you're going to know what to test for, or you're going to learn the hard way.
So Sky asked earlier to show her a coral that could handle her one par. This is that coral. These are that coral.
Yeah, so in a way, it's kind of easier or cheaper to keep these because they don't need an LED light or any sort of light, which is typically very expensive. But they're going to have some other weird esoteric need that you need to learn about before you try to keep these.
100%. Some of them actually prefer lower light or lower to no light.
Let's talk more about gorgonians and sponges because I have a lot of sponges in my tank that just grew out of nowhere, but those are not the more difficult ones to keep.
Yes.
There's a type of sponge that kind of looks like a gorgonian. It's called a spider sponge. It needs literally zero light and it needs to eat all the time because it filter feeds. It basically inhales and exhales the water and absorbs silicates and other weird nutrients from the water that way. There are some gorgonians that aren't in tier 6. They're actually relatively easy to keep if you can find them for sale, but I would still put it at maybe like a tier 3 because they're difficult to find and they are relatively fragile when you first get them. Banana, have you ever kept gorgonians?
I love gorgonians. I've kept a few of them, yeah. I've kept a few of them. They're very fun.
Are they all photosynthetic or do you have any of the tier 6s?
I used to keep tier 6s back when I was feeding my tank more. So the coral that we haven't even said the coral that are in this group yet. Sun coral is it used to be more common, but one that you'll see a lot. They're little small tubby polyps that cluster up. They're like dendros that we mentioned earlier, or they're like Duncans that we mentioned earlier, but you'll see them in weird colors like yellow. You'll see a black one, you'll see an orange one. Those are usually sun coral. And if they're all clustered together and small, they are not photosynthetic. So if you see something so as a black Duncan, it's probably just it's probably just a sun coral. Dendros are a kind of harder to keep still sun coral. So even though it's tier 6, the harder end of tier 6 is a dendro. And that's walking dendros. That includes, dendros that are... I had a fathead dendro. It was really, really cool. It was nice fluorescent orange. But you had to frequently feed it, or otherwise you would see it, the tissue start to recede and it wouldn't open up. Gorgonians are one that are commonly sold. Odds are, if you see a really cool yellow or orange or really brightly colored gorgonian, it will most likely be a non-photosynthetic one.
Yeah, so be very careful when buying stuff like this. Some of them can't even be exposed to air, like sponges especially. So again, there's very specific needs that these corals have. And then even once you start keeping some of these non-photosynthetic ones, you have to keep them in the dark, so you don't even really get to enjoy them to the full extent.
Dendros, for example, Tubasteria, sun coral, dendros, and a really cool one that I actually like called carnations. I actually prefer to be in the dark. So they'll really only open up when there's a low light. During the daytime, they'll close up, and at night is when you see them get really puffy and like the really flowery polyps start to come out. It's gorgeous, but odds are you won't be able to enjoy this during the day. You only see it during the night, and it's not really worth the coral to buy, except for being able to say, hey, I have this, because you're not going to enjoy it as much as you would other coral.
Yeah, so it's similar to in like a freshwater tank buying a catfish or buying a pleco. If you don't have the right tank for it, you can't even see them all because they're hiding in the cave all the time until nighttime. And these corals are expensive. They're beautiful. If you don't have the right tank for them, you're not going to be able to get like the maximum amount of enjoyment out of them.
Yeah, I remember back in the day, you'd be able to find a fair-sized sun coral colony. The black ones, orange ones, for around 60 for a fairly sized cluster. That's like 3 inches in diameter. But nowadays, people know more about them. They know you can't keep them. They know that you're not going to be able to house them for too long. So if a store gets them, they'll try to move it as quick as possible so they don't lose it. Sponges are in that category too. You wanted to talk about those?
Yes. So sponges again are going to be. It's probably the most varied species of underwater invertebrate, or at least one of them. And within that, there's a wide range of care needs. At the very easiest end of the spectrum are pineapple sponges. Those will probably show up in your tank the moment you start it, or at least in the first couple days. They'll come and go as nutrient levels change, but it is a good sign that you're starting a tank in the right way.
Yeah.
They're called pineapple sponges because they literally look like pineapples. It's very cute. They're like weird. They're like a ghost pineapple. It's kind of hard to describe.
They're really cool.
But for the most part, there will be weird spongy growths in your tank that pop up over time, and those are usually non-photosynthetic sponges that'll show up. And you'll keep them by accident, but they're not going to be the prettiest ones. The more advanced ones are more difficult to keep and usually more expensive. So the spider sponge I mentioned, it's probably not a real sponge. It's probably somewhere in between a sponge and a gorgonian, but it looks very cool, so people buy them a lot. And they will be difficult to keep.
Spider sponges they're really, really cool. When you look at the little polyps that come out of them, it's amazing.
Yeah. And I think they're a tunicate and sponge hybrid. Tunicates are another weird, like, tier 6 coral that you probably won't keep unless you keep it by accident. But yeah, as your tank matures, these sponges will kind of grow in the darker areas of your tanks. There's some cool, like, slightly easier photosynthetic sponges you can buy. There's the blue plating sponge, which is getting a lot more popular, or at least a lot more common. That one's really cool because it's almost like a plating coral, and it's photosynthetic, so it's relatively easy to keep. But it's not stony, so it's like a weird floppy disc.
I used to love that. I had that before it became popular. I can say that. I feel like a hipster saying it, but yeah, I had that way back in like that 2016, 2017. Around 2014.
You probably haven't heard of it. It's pretty underground.
Basically, it's really cool. Like they come over to buy coral, right? And they would see that Montipora shaped thing in the back, and it was a really cool purple plate, smooth, and like, what is that? And I was like, oh, it's a sponge. And I would take the feeding rod, and I would just wiggle it with it real quick, and they'd be amazed. I love seeing people's reaction when they saw that. When they saw the jiggle from the sponge.
And wait, that thing just move?
yeah. Basically, they're like, "What is that? A Monty? Why is it moving in the water?" Like, no, man, that's a sponge.
Well, if it goes really high, you can get Monties to move in the flood. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. No, now you see them everywhere. Now you see them way everywhere. But I can say it. I've had mine since but I had it before they were cool. I feel like a hipster.
Oh.
All right. Yeah, there are SPS in this category too. Stylaster is one of my favorites, and then encrusting coralline. Or not encrusting, branching coralline is also another one that requires a lot of care.
What was that one?
Stylaster. It's
yeah,
cool, growy, branchy red acropora or SPS looking thing. It's not.
Yeah, the lace coral, right?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
I didn't know this was a real thing. I thought it was just like a cartoonist's impression of a coral.
Nope.
Like they were combining a stony coral and a gorgonian, but it is a real thing, and their growth patterns are so freaking cool.
The cool thing is, like, when you look at acropora, right? When you look at SPS, their branches will grow into. If two acropora branches cross, they will blend, and they will blend into one another, right? Stylaster will not do that. Stylaster corals actually grow until they reach one another, and then they don't morph into one another the way that acropora do. And you can see big giant colonies, and they have little vein like shapes because of the fact that they don't grow into one another.
It's kind of it's almost like a fractal, and that's because it evolved to maximize surface area or maximize water exposure or maximize the amount of space it takes up. These are like really weird primal entities that are like the million-year-old ancestors to the corals that we keep today. So it's a very cool like subculture of of saltwater reef keeping, and that's why it's probably recommended for tier 6 reefers at best.
100%, 100%. And yeah, that's here's 1 through 6. Don't try one before trying out the one behind it. And there are exceptions to everything. You're going to see that one person that's like, hey, I just brought my reef tank. I just started. I set it up yesterday. And what do I do? And the tricky will be fine. There's always that one in a million or that one exception to that rule.
And usually the distinction for people that are like accidentally successful like this is they have a good LFS and they either don't know it yet or they know it and they're willing to just like kind of jump right into the fray. But the more you learn about how to diagnose like the skill level of your LFS, how to diagnose the health level of the corals that you're buying, the easier it is to take jumps like that.
And its odds are, if you can't name the coral species, right? Don't buy it. If you don't know, if you're trying to buy something, hey, what is this coral? I'm not saying like the type or the strain or the morph, right? Like the Jason Fox XNX or whatever. I'm saying like if you don't know that it's an Acropora, if you don't know that it's Acantho, don't buy it, because those are research 3 times before you buy something.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that I'm pretty much talked out on our topic of the week. Do you want to talk about the myth?
All right. So the myth of the week is, we talked about coral you should add to test the waters. We talked about coral that are a little harder to keep. And the myth of the week is that all easy coral are good coral for beginners, or just good coral to have. And it's not always the case. It is not always the case.
So I kind of tricked you. I don't actually agree with you. So I'm gonna like devil's advocate here, but talk through your topic first, and then.
All right. So my main belief with this is that some of the coral that you can get in the beginning can actually become so invasive that they will be the reason that people leave their hobby later on. And that's the reason that people will take down some of their tanks sometimes. This mainly goes to 2 or 3 different kinds of species. Poculopora being one of them. Poculopora is a very easy SPS to keep. It's a very, very good beginner. But it's super invasive. It does this thing called polyp bailout, where when it gets really stressed, it'll release all the polyps that it has into the water. And every little polyp will find a place to cover, and it's gonna slowly start growing. And everyone always says the exact same thing when they first start seeing it happen. It's fine. It's cool. I love Poculopora anyways. It's pretty. I love it. And then 2 months pass and their Pockies are growing everywhere, covering everything, drowning out some of the more expensive SPS. Suddenly, like, you'll have cases where there will be a dead spot on an acro, and Poculopora will start growing on the dead spot. And then
I think it's also a spawning method, and I think
it is a spawning method too.
It's one of the reasons that Poculopora is like the foundation of most reefs. It's one of those what we call reef building corals, because it literally, the skeleton that it builds really quickly and really efficiently lays the groundwork for a lot of like the actual barrier reefs, larger reef ecosystems. And the reason they do that is they are they spread incredibly fast once they're happy. They won't always polyp bail out when they're stressed. Sometimes they'll do it if they reach a certain colony size or when some other trigger happens that we're not quite aware of yet. And it's good and it's bad, right? It's the easiest coral to spawn in captivity because it'll just kind of do it sometimes. But most reef tanks are not big enough to be prepared for a coral to spawn.
Yeah, spawning events are very, very messy. Especially Poculopora. I'm telling you, it always goes the exact same way. It's always the exact same story. Someone has Pocky in the tank. You go, hey, you're going to regret having that. You should get rid of that. No, it's fine. I don't mind it. I love it. I can have more. Fast forward a few weeks, months, however, right? The Poculopora spawned. Polyp bailout. Surprise. Your reef is now in danger. It happens the exact same way. Another one that's super invasive is a Hollywood Sunner Chalice. It's a very, very fast grower. It'll grow, I'm talking like an inch a month kind of fast growing. But the downsides are that this coral has tentacles and sweeper tentacles that are the longest of any chalice that we have so far in the hobby. So I'm talking anything within like 2 inches of that coral is gonna get burnt. I had one. They get longer too. They get longer, 3 to 4 inches maybe, but it grows so fast and then it grows so fast that no one's gonna want it. So you're gonna be breaking off chunks of this to throw it away, and you're gonna. It's one of those. God, I regret ever putting this in my tank. I'm never getting this again, kind of coral. And surprise, you're breaking off a chunk. A piece falls onto the sand bed, or a piece falls onto another rock. You know what's gonna happen, Billy? Another Procky event. It's like you're gonna have another event where this coral, the Hollywood Stone Chalice, is encrusting over everything, and it's messy. It's a very messy coral.
So I disagree a little bit. I have multiple weed infestation coral level corals in my tank, and I don't think a coral can ever truly outpace a human reef keeper. Like if you have green star polyp in your tank and it's starting to take over, it's still only going to grow like an inch per week, right? Like it's still a glacial pace compared to you looking at your reef tank every day. You can, if you have a xenia outbreak, you can razor blade it off of the glass. You can chop up your rocks and kind of winnow it down. The only issue you're going to run into is if it starts growing into other corals or over other corals. But that, again, that's going to happen at a pace where you can be reactive or even proactive and prepare your reef for that. If you want to keep a Hollywood Stunner coral, it's not going to suddenly take over your tank overnight, right? It's going to take at least a couple weeks to get close enough to sting your other stuff, and you can break it off. Like it's basically chipboard. You can break it off pretty easily and keep it in check.
Wait, which coral?
Hollywood Stunner.
So they're not if it encrusts though. That's the thing. If it's encrusting, you're gonna have a hard time chipping it off.
Yeah, and if it will come back. Rock, then you can. If you're worried about it taking over, you can take that rock out and chip off the parts that have Hollywood Stunner on rock.
It's like the center of your tank.
Well, then don't put it there. So it's a mix of keeping these corals in check, and you will struggle with one coral or another because at some point one coral is going to get so happy that it's just outgrowing and outpacing every other coral. Xenia, green star polyp, Hollywood Stunner, these are the corals that are more prone to do that. But I had a Hollywood Stunner that I kept in like maybe 40 par, and it couldn't grow because it was too.
You killed it. You make it suffer. Punish the Stunner. Punish the coral so it doesn't grow to hand.
I mean, it's kind of punishing it, but it is still alive and it still grows, but it grows a lot slower. And it's far enough away from my other corals because it's basically in the dark that it can't really sweeper tentacle them.
Here's a counterpoint to that, Billy. Okay.
Yeah.
You've mentioned coral that grow from one colony outright. You're talking about a coral where the colony itself gets bigger and you just trim down the colony. And yeah, that's doable for almost everything. Okay, what about polyp bailout? Right?
Yeah. Okay. So that's to my rule. I do think if you're going to get a possible you should be ready for it.
What about Xenia? Because there are a lot of cases where people get Xenia and you're fragging it, right? And it's like Aptasia, where a single strand of Xenia hair that gets out will start a whole colony. And sometimes it's not somewhere that you'll check everywhere. So unless you're doing a full sweep of every single thing in your tank, it's a very possible chance that you'll have Xenia growing in an area that you don't want it to. And because you're just so bare minimum, bare care, bare requirement coral, you're going to have them growing in areas that require very little light or very little flow or very little anything. GSP is easy. GSP, you just peel it off and cut. Mushrooms, you just scrape it off. Xenia, you can just scrape it off a rock. But how many times are you going to be scraping off the rock next to one of your Ganies if a Xenia colony starts growing on it?
That's very true. And again, these are kind of extreme cases. A lot of the time, your weed level coral might not even survive to the point where it can become a problem. But if you do own these corals and you're willing to take the risk just to kind of prove that you can take care of them, so for something like a green star polyp or a Xenia, you should still get them. You shouldn't not buy the coral because it's eventually going to grow too quickly.
Yeah.
But you should plan ahead and keep it isolated, or at least be willing to kind of hone it back. It's like gardening. You have to prune your garden for it to grow successfully and to be the best situation it can possibly be in.
Except for Pakalapora. Oh, I agree with all of them except for Pakalapora. Zinnia, even like the Hollywood Thunder, if you're gonna keep it on a rock growing in its little island, go ham because it's not gonna spread.
Oh, that's a good segue into our kryptonite corals. So Banana is talking a lot about how bird's nest and Paslepora are literally invasive and destructive to reefs if they get to a certain point. I am a tier 4 reefer, and yet I love that we have tiers for ourselves now. I'm a tier 4 reefer, and yet I have never successfully kept a bird's nest, and I've only been able to keep one Stylophora alive. So for some people and for some tanks, or maybe it's my LFSs even, no, it's probably me. For some reefers, certain corals that are supposed to be at a lower tier are actually really difficult to keep. What's your kryptonite?
I cannot grow GSP for the life of me. I can't grow GSP. I can't. I've tried it so many times, and it always, kind of shrivel up. And I used to have a gorgeous GSP rock. It was like a giant pillarish rock flowing with GSP. It looked like a green flame when it was flowing. But then, ever since I started the new tank, it just won't grow for me. And I think it might have been in part to the filefish invasion when I had a filefish that was, decided, hey, fuck you, I'm taking other coral that are expensive and the cheap ones too.
I'm just gonna become a correlating fish.
Basically, yeah. But essentially, I don't know. Maybe if I try it now that the fish is gone, it'll be better. But I don't know. Let's see.
So what I would recommend is if you're at a certain level and yet you cannot seem to keep a certain coral that should be easier, it might not be you. And for that reason, and that reason alone, you should probably max out at trying 2 or 3 times to keep a coral. Yeah. If it ends up dying, you're either getting it from the wrong people and it's coming in sick. That's especially the case for like a torch coral, because they're, again, difficult but not impossible. There's thousands of reef tanks on Instagram that are just littered with torches. And you're gonna have to kind of intervene on yourself. So a really good example of that is I couldn't keep Xenia for the first couple months of my reef tank. And it was because of that copper issue. But because I solved that copper issue after I killed 2 of them, I was able to then buy another Xenia and not kill it. But be ready to kind of cut yourself off. Be like, okay, this coral is dying for some reason and I don't know why. There is something killing it in the tank or in the LFS where I bought it from, but I don't know what it is. And until I can truly diagnose it, I'm not going to waste more money on this coral. So that's me with bird's nest. It's Banana with green star polyp. And that's crazy. GSP should be a tier 1 coral. It's basically a tier 0 coral. You could keep it in a pot of salt water, and put it on your stove, and it would be fine. But there's something in his tank, or there's something that he does that specifically prevents him from keeping it successfully. So is he going to go out and spend another $20 to $30 on more GSP frags? Probably not, because something in his tank prevents him from being able to keep it. And yet he can keep some of the most advanced stuff in the hobby. So everyone's different. Every reef is screwed up in its own weird, unique way. And that's how it be. It be like that sometimes,
Yeah. Yep. Yep. All right. Oh, we have questions. Real questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So Sky asked, how do I kill Bryopsis? Bryopsis is a very specific type of kind of algae.
Gross feathery. It's very feathery.
Yeah, it's a
simple
weird,
question. It is
burn-like algae. Go for it.
Fluconazole. Fluconazole is the kill-all for Bryopsis. I've heard people that use reflux, but I've also heard very many horror stories with reflux.
Oh.
I instead prefer to use straight Fluconazole. I have a source that I can send it to you too. It's a little shady, but it works perfectly. It's a little shady. It's a marketing scheme. Come join my pyramid scheme. It's fun.
It's a flux scheme. Fluconazole.
It's a flux screen, a reflux screen.
Yeah. So what fluconazole does, it's an antifungal, I think, but it kills some weird symbiotic thing that the Bryopsis needs to survive.
Yeah.
Or there's some weird fungus inside the Bryopsis. I don't know. Yeah. Or it is a fungus. Reefing is weird and confusing. Basically, within 5 days, that Bryopsis will be gone.
Yeah. It works wonders.
And then it's also effective against green hair algae, but it's a much riskier procedure because it takes longer for it to have effect. And the longer that stuff is in your water, the more complications are likely to arise.
Usually. We're still discovering a lot of stuff when it comes to antibiotics and water, or antifungals and reefs. There's a whole lot of mixed opinions. because people think, and to us it makes sense, right, that it will leave the coral barren of any kind of immune response, right?
Yeah.
Kind of like if you nuke a person with antibiotics, their immune system becomes absolute shit.
Yeah.
And coral, to a certain degree, are able to resist some kinds of bacteria or some kinds of infections, which is why people think that frequently dosing antibiotics into your tank, right, to prevent brown jelly works to an extent, but then boom, your coral now have no defense mechanisms against things that do cause brown jelly. So when you do stop dosing or treating with it, wow, well, now what do you do? You know?
Exactly.
There's still so much that we don't know.
Ozzy asks, does fluconazole kill turf algae? And it depends. So like I mentioned, it does kill green hair algae, which can sometimes be a turf algae, but algae are very little understood in science and very more understood, less understood in the hobby. So you have to be careful. Well, you don't have to be careful. You can try it. It's worth a shot, especially if it reaches like plague proportions. I've had a couple times where my tank just has so much algae in it that I cannot win the battle by myself, and I pull in Flux as kind of my contract killer, and it usually works. With turf algae in particular, I think lettuce nudibranchs are a potential solution.
Urchins.
Oh, and urchins. Yeah,
Urchins are the lawnmowers of the reef.
I still don't have coralline in my tank because I've just had an urchin for the whole lifespan of my tank, and they munch on coralline too. So if you're really adamant on having coralline encrusting everything, I wouldn't get an urchin. But if you're having turf algae issues, you won't have enough coralline because the turf algae will outcompete. Favorite Monty?
Ooh, my favorite Monty is the Sunset Monty. It's orange with very bright green polyps.
Ooh. Oh yeah, my LFS has those. I haven't bought one yet. Maybe I'll go get one. Mine is digitata, which is a very vague like subspecies of Montipora, but it's the branching kind. It's probably one of the easier corals to keep that gives you that branching shape. And so I've had them in my tank since like probably 3 months in, and they grow like absolute weeds. But again, it's easy enough to crop them back. That's not a huge issue. There's also a lot of color forms. I have a type of branching Montipora that's not a digi, but it's called Carinata. It's from the Philippines, and it's bright orange, like eye-melting orange.
Ooh.
So there's a lot of corals in the digitata subspecies that make it my favorite type of Monty.
All right, Sky asked, what is the hardest coral to keep in your opinion? We just covered a fair amount of them.
Yeah, listen to the episode.
Really good. Just rewatch the episode. I think elegance corals, because I know with elegance, if there's a single cut, the chances go down significantly.
Yeah.
Oh, in the community, and PS Gorgonians are very frequently bought, and they're very frequently lost.
Yeah,
very frequently lost. Like of every 100 that are sold, one of them will be kept. And there's so many that are sold. Almost every LFS you go to is gonna have the standard, like the bright yellow one with the polyps. Horrible, absolutely horrible. Most of them don't make it. The orange ones too, or red fingers, very hard to make it.
That's the reason that they show up in these stores, is because people will buy them without knowing the name or without knowing how complicated that type of coral / algae is to keep. So it's basically free money for the LFS, because that coral will die, and then that person will have to come back and either try again or buy something else. So know what you buy before you buy it. If you make an impulse buy, figure out what it is as soon as you can, and be willing to return corals to the store if it's like a non-photosynthetic coral that you're not ready for.
If your store won't return something, won't accept something back like that, like if you take it home and then you're like, oh shit, this won't do well, you take it back to the store. If they refuse it, I would not go back to the store.
They literally just scammed you.
They know what they sold you. You're not the person who've done it.
Or they don't, and ignorance is not an excuse for. I would say, I don't even know. I don't sprinkle with any corals.
Really keeps all the coral.
No, I can't keep. Like I mentioned, I can't keep bird's nest / Postlepora / any of those SPS that are supposed to be easier. That's why I like Digi so much, is because it's a bird's nest that doesn't die on me. I have trouble with branching cyphastria. That one's really tricky for me. So I would say that's and it's expensive enough where it feels bad that I've bought it like 3 or 4 times. I just don't buy it anymore because I clearly there's something wrong with my tank or my caretaking methods. So I just don't.
Yeah. All right, and then so basically, the banana asked, "What is the goofiest fish that you know of?" You can answer this one first. I know which one mine is.
Plenty's for me.
My blennies.
No,
Answer actually. Which one is it?
Hawk is like a short blenny, and they basically sit in your tank and watch all day. They sit there and look at you like you just tased their mother.
Basically, they just sit there and watch you.
And yeah, they're
not shrimp friendly.
How about you?
The starry blending. I love my starry blending. I oh my god. Before my old tank crash where I lost everything from the parasites, I had a starry blending that I named ceviche. Which if you don't know, it's the name of a seafood dish, a Spanish seafood dish. And I would call it that because this blending in particular loved to sleep inside of the wave makers when they were off. My MP40s, the pumps. When they stopped, the first thing he would do is he would dive right in there. He would just chill there. And I would always have to stick my finger in the tank and make sure it's out of the pump before before I turn it on. So yeah, that's how you got the name ceviche.
There's no goofier joy than watching a blenny who has a barnacle shell that he loves to hide in, because they will swim backwards into the barnacle. Like you'll basically hear the reverse beeps, like when a truck is reversing.
And they walk him backward the barnacle.
And they try to do this thing where they'll swim forward out of their barnacle and they'll go all the way over to the other side of the tank to get food, and then they try to reverse all the way back
to that,
and they get lost. And they have to give up and actually go forward. They'll switch. It's very cute.
Bunnies are awesome. They're seriously underrated. I love them.
I have my favorite bunny is the Midas bunny, but I do think starries are goofier. And the one I currently have is called a Smithy bunny, which is actually a really cool one.
Smithy. Is that a fang?
I think it looks like one, but it's black and white. It's like a
it's a fang blenny. It's a white fang blenny. Yeah, those are nice. They're pretty cool.
They're gorgeous, and there's not too many fish that have that color combo. Well, there are, but they don't look like that. Like they're not long.
Mine will play with my hand whenever it's chilling on the Gorgonian. Like it'll perch itself on the most random things, and I'll put my hand on it. It'll just swim around my hand, and it'll like swim to the end of my finger and just perch on there and look over the reef.
Yeah, they're like dogs, really dumb dogs.
Maya the papaya asks, "What is a popular coral that you think is ugly or overrated?" You can go first, Billy.
I think torches are overhyped, and well, any coral that costs more than $100 is probably overhyped, and torches are difficult enough to keep. But people, like especially beginners, will be told that they're just euphilia, and they'll buy a $200 one for their 3-month-old reef tank, and it'll die. It'll sting all their other corals, and then it'll die. And they'll be like, "What the hell? I just spent $200 on this noodle thing, and it didn't even live." But they are beautiful, and a lot of people love them. So I do recognize and validate the appeal that they have, but they're just not for me. I have one dragon soul torch, and it's cool, but I spent $100 on it, and I'll probably never buy another.
Have some of the fun ones. You gotta try the Holy Grails.
Yeah, but what is a Holy Grail? There's like there's literally a meta. Torch meta is wild. There's a meta culture around torch corals. They all have these weird, vague, but specific names.
You gotta be able to identify them. I've gotten to the point where I can tell them apart.
But then most fish stores can't tell them apart. So they'll just call them all Holy Grails and charge $300 for like a green torch. So it's like any fad, it is rife with misinformation and either misleading things or like outright scams. But
is right.
Can you educate me?
So the Holy Grail, there's two. There's a reverse and the regular, but the tentacle itself is divided into 2 colors. One's a very, very bright phosphorus, like fluorescent yellow, and then the rest is a very light fluorescent green. So it transitions from the green to the yellow, and it's got this little weird mix in between them. That's regular. And then the reverse is the yellow mouth-ish, and then it spreads out, and then you can see it turns into the green. And as you get into torches, you can kind of identify which ones are which. Like, you know that Australian torches are usually the ones that have the white or the colorless little balls at the end. And if they're green, they're mostly Indonesian.
Yeah, so there's a whole metaculture to torches that I don't understand. And because I don't understand it, I don't like it. So what's your overhyped coral that you don't like?
Cyanurinas.
Yeah, there we go.
I don't like Cyanurinas.
Bringing it back, maybe.
Right back full circle, dude. I don't like Cyanurina. They're overrated. I used to think torches were crap. I used to think SPS were crap. When I first started, I was like, torches are kind of overrated. I don't like it. I don't get the hype. As you start keeping them, and as you start building your torch garden, you can kind of see which ones are which. Like the Princess Peach, which is like a straight gold torch. You can also see which ones are the tiger torches. You see the bases kind of go up in striations. Why I can't say the word now? Striations. Yeah. Yep. But yeah.
And it's sort of a defense mechanism. Like you, when you're early on in the hobby, when I was early on in the hobby, I thought acros were dumb and ugly. And I think in retrospect, part of the reason I thought that was because I knew I couldn't keep them. And I was sort of protecting myself from spending way too much money on a colorful stick that was just going to die in my tank.
That's how I thought, dude. They're just sticks. There's no movement to them. They're not as enjoyable. But then when you see your first colony growing in your tank, like, oh, this ain't too bad.
Yeah, something clicks more. You decide, wait, I was wrong.
It grows on you. It grows on you. Except Sign Arenas. I don't think that'll ever grow on me.
Yeah, I think they're unique. They have like a cool like holographic effect because they're semi-transparent. But I would never be able to justify spending as much as they cost.
Endophilia is fine. I love Endophilia, but just Sign Arena itself, little bubbles.
And you describe the difference, or is it?
Endophilia grows flat, so it's like it melted.
Oh.
So it'll have like a shorter top and a wider base.
Oh, yeah.
It's like it melts flat onto the sand.
It's like a design arena, but it's
basically.
Okay.
Basically.
And there's a leather between Endophilias are halfway between Cynarinas and Acanthophilia, right?
Kind of, yeah.
Not genetic,
Endophilia are between Acanthos and.
Hey, did we miss anyone else's question? Oh, why is it so hard to find a maze coral?
It's not.
They're poorly defined, and they're in a genus that is so frequently miscategorized that they probably either don't buy them or they don't bother to label them. You need to know what you're looking for. What kind of maze corals are there? There's Platygyra is one, I think.
Platygyra. Basically, we've gotten to the point where any maze coral is a very generic term used for any coral that grows kind of round and like a brain maze coral kind of thing. But leptos can be classified as maze coral. Well, Platygyra is a maze coral. I'm thinking of right now. I have one. It's not a lepto. I'm trying to remember the name.
I think because he specifically said maze, I think he's looking for the corals that actually look like they have a maze-like pattern on them. So,
Platygyra.
You see, the problem is even we don't really know the difference, and so an LFS that doesn't really know corals is certainly not going to know. If you want like a literal maze, I just put the two names in the chat. You want to look for a Platygyra or a Wilsoni. Wilsoni is like a fluffy maze. Platygyra is more of like a skeletal maze.
Wilsonis are nice, but
there's a type of like it's called a favia, but it looks more like a maze coral. It's called a raptor favia. And I think it's it's the full favia. Never mind. So I bought something that had the colors of a raptor favia, but it's shaped more like a maze brain. Oh yeah, I think it's a Goniastria, honestly.
There's different kinds. There's open brain coral as well, which are Wilsonis, Cricophilias. Those things normally in a hobby we'll see them get in at around 3-4 inches, 6 inches, etc. But in the wild they get massive.
They're literally called a massive coral. Like the type of growth form is called just massive. It's massive in reef building, I think is what they're called, because they'll build one big mound, which is the mass.
A super thick skeleton.
Yeah, and I think Lobo is technically a
Lobo counts as well, yeah. But the cool thing with Lobos is like in the hobby you'll see 5-6 heads of Lobos, but in the wild it's literal hundreds and hundreds of Lobo heads clumped together into one giant, like 4-foot diameter ball. Right, the ocean is huge, so all the corals that we see now are taken from full colonies that are several feet across. So if you take one of your hard corals and look at it, and it's like, holy shit! Can you imagine just like a 3-foot ball of this one specific coral?
Yeah. So, but what you can do is try to find an online shop that does wholesale. So I think like an ORA, they probably have a maze brand that they aquaculture. And most LFSs will have an account with those wholesalers, and you can kind of special order it, or just keep an eye out know what you're looking for. For a maze brain in particular, if it's fragged, it's going to take forever to grow back into a maze. So you want to look for the colony sizes, because otherwise you're not going to be able to see the maze pattern. So it could be a Fabia that's just been fragged too bad, or it's the right thing, but it's going to take forever to actually make a maze shape. Yeah, but Goniastria, Platygyra, and Symphilia wilsoni are 3 names to look for. And make sure they are long, elongated polyps with large distinct ridges around the polyp or around the mouths. I'll just do that. There was a really cool Reef Builders episode where they found a Goniastria at Reefapalooza, Dallas, or maybe Florida somewhere, and it was a really cool rainbow maze brain that probably sold for $5,000. So if you want to see a cool one, look at that one.
I think I remember the one you're talking about. Yeah.
There's no shame in being a tier 1 reefer for 20 years. People have done it, especially in the early days of the hobby. They had no choice but to do it because they could only give tier 1. There's no prestige to being a higher tier. It's literally just how much money you've spent and how many mistakes you've made in pursuit of something that is very difficult.
I think some of the most gorgeous tanks I've seen are actually composed of tier 1, tier 2 coral. I'm talking leathers and soft coral tanks have a very, very unique beauty to them. And I don't know, I just think it's pretty cool.
All right, so last thing, some bookkeeping. If you want to join us for the live recordings of our podcast, we do it every Tuesday. And then once we have a backlog of pre-records, we will start publishing episodes every Friday morning on most of the popular podcatcher apps. So if you don't want to join us live and ask us questions like all the lovely people in chat, you can always catch our recorded ones post-produced every Friday.
Once we get it. I mean, we're down to, but we'll make up for them.
Yeah, we'll find them or we'll re-record. It'll be fun.
Yeah.
All right.
Alrighty. Thank you so much, guys, for listening in. If you're live, thank you for joining us. If you're listening to recording, thank you for supporting us and hearing what we have to say. Enjoy the hobby. Just enjoy it. Take it slow. Easy reefing, guys.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Slice of the Reef,
your number 1 podcast for all things fishy, with your hosts Giancarlo and Billy. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that podcasts are held. That way, you'll never miss an episode. If you want to be a part of our podcast, join us on discord.xyz/Slice of the Reef, where we'll be recording in front of a live audience. We also give you a moment at the end of every episode for a live Q&A session, and we're very interactive with our fans. So we'd love for you to join. You can also check out our website for articles, guides, calculators, and information on our upcoming episodes at sliceofthereef.org. Hope to see you guys soon.
Farewell and easy reefing.